Looking at the story you've provided, I notice the template format you've specified is designed for animal encounter stories. But this story centers on archaeological discovery and engineering secrets. I'll adapt the structure to fit the actual narrative. In a drought-stricken territorial town, a widowed schoolteacher was about to make the purchase of his lifetime. What started as a routine government auction took a shocking turn when he came face to face with ancient Roman engineering that defied everything historians believed possible. Elias Marrow wasn't your typical small-town educator. For 3 years, since his wife's death, he had spent his life quietly teaching and raising his 16-year-old daughter Anya. Known for his stubborn curiosity and his father's disgraced legacy of impossible engineering theories. When he encountered the abandoned aqueduct at the territorial auction, he had no idea he was walking into a conspiracy that stretched back centuries. Elias raised his hand for a 35-cent bid that would lead to the discovery of hidden chambers filled with working Roman hydraulic systems worth millions. What began as an impulse purchase driven by mysterious family manuscripts would become a battle against powerful men who profited from water scarcity. The entire valley would never be the same after Elias chose to activate mechanisms that could transform deserts into gardens and prove that abundance had always been possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's hammer struck wood with the finality of a judgment. 35 cents for an aqueduct that had stood untouched for centuries, its weathered stones bearing witness to the endless cycle of neglect that had become this town's defining characteristic. Elias Marrow raised his hand higher than any schoolteacher in the territory had dared before, but the men around him weren't looking at his bid with respect. They were looking at him with the same expression they'd worn at his wife's funeral 3 years prior, a mixture of pity and barely concealed satisfaction that he would soon learn his place among the foolish. What they couldn't see was the strange marking carved into the aqueduct's foundation, visible only from where Elias stood at the edge of the gathering, a symbol that matched the one sketched in faded ink on the manuscript pages his father had left behind. A manuscript Elias had never understood until this moment, when recognition struck him like lightning through drought-dry air. The auctioneer called, "Sold to Mr. Marrow!" But his voice seemed to come from very far away, because Elias had just realized something that made his heart race with equal parts terror and possibility. This wasn't a random purchase born of sentiment or stubborn pride. This was the beginning of something that had been waiting for him long before he even knew he was looking for it. But as he stepped forward to claim his 35-cent aqueduct, Councilman Darius Horn's eyes met his across the crowd, and that practiced smile told Elias everything he needed to know. Darius had been waiting too. The deed transfer took place in the shadow of the aqueduct itself, as if the ancient structure demanded to witness its own sale. Elias stood with the crumpled paper in his hands, feeling the weight of every stare from the dispersing crowd. 35 cents? The amount felt both insignificant and enormous. Mr. Marrow. Darius Horn's voice carried the tone of a man who had never been denied anything important. Congratulations on your acquisition. Elias turned to face him, noting how the councilman's expensive coat made his own weathered teaching clothes seem like a declaration of poverty. Thank you, Councilman Horn. I do hope you know what you're doing. Darius's eyes moved from Elias's face to the aqueduct's weathered stone blocks. That structure has been abandoned for good reason. Some say it brings misfortune to those who meddle with it. I don't believe in superstitions. Elias folded the deed carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket next to his father's manuscript. I believe in preserving history. Darius's laugh was sharp as winter wind, cutting through valley stone. History. How noble! He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a register that wouldn't carry to the lingering onlookers. Tell me, what does a widowed schoolteacher plan to do with a crumbling Roman relic? Surely you're not thinking of restoration work. The question stung because it carried the assumption that had followed Elias everywhere since Margaret died. That he was helpless without her practical wisdom. That he needed guidance from stronger, wealthier, more connected men. That a schoolteacher's curiosity was no match for the real world's harsh mathematics. I plan to study it properly. The words came out stronger than he felt. And discover what the original builders intended. Study it, Darius's eyebrows raised in mock surprise. My dear fellow, do you have any idea what proper archaeological work costs? The equipment alone would bankrupt most families in this territory. Around them, other auction attendees were mounting their horses, loading wagons, preparing to return to their lives and businesses. But Elias noticed how many lingered, ears tuned to their conversation. This wasn't just polite post-auction discussion anymore. This was entertainment, watching the eccentric schoolteacher get his comeuppance from the town's most powerful man. Then it's fortunate I have more curiosity than most families, Elias replied, meeting Darius's gaze directly and refusing to look away first. Something flickered across the councilman's face. Surprise, perhaps, or even a hint of respect. But it vanished quickly, replaced by something colder and more calculating. No, Darius said slowly, you certainly are different from most. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and insulting. Good day, Mr. Marrow. I do hope your project brings you everything you deserve. He turned and walked away, but Elias caught the way Darius glanced back at the aqueduct one final time. Not at Elias himself, but at the structure, as if he was looking for something specific in those ancient stones. When the last wagon disappeared over the ridge, Elias found himself alone with his purchase. The aqueduct loomed against the afternoon sky, its weathered arches casting long shadows across the ground like fingers reaching toward the dried riverbed that had once carried life through this valley. He approached slowly, running his fingers along the symbol carved into the foundation stone. The mark was deeper than he'd realized from a distance. Deliberately carved, carefully maintained, despite the structure's apparent abandonment. Someone had been taking care of this supposedly forgotten aqueduct. But who and why? Papa! Anya's voice carried across the field as she approached on her horse, 16 years old and fearless in the way that both terrified and inspired him. So you actually bought it? I did, he turned to face his daughter, seeing Margaret's determination in the set of her jaw and his own. Father's mechanical curiosity in the way her eyes immediately began examining the aqueduct's construction. 35 cents for a pile of old stones, she said. But her tone held admiration rather than mockery. Mama would have called you completely mad. Your mother would have asked me what I planned to do with it, Elias corrected. And then she would have helped me figure out how to do it properly. Anya dismounted and approached the foundation, her fingers tracing the same symbol that had caught his attention. This looks fresh, she said, like someone's been carving on it recently. Trust his daughter to notice what the entire auction crowd had missed. What do you think it means? She studied the mark, a circle with 3 lines extending outward like a simplified sun. It looks like something grandfather might have drawn. All those mechanical diagrams in his notebooks. She glanced at him sideways. You brought his manuscript, didn't you? The one you never let me read. Elias pulled the leather portfolio from his coat, its pages yellowed with age and secrecy. Perhaps it's time you saw what your grandfather was working on before he died. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across his father's handwriting as Elias spread the manuscript pages across his kitchen table. Anya leaned over his shoulder, her breathing quick with excitement as she took in the intricate diagrams that had remained hidden for 20 years. Papa, these aren't just engineering drawings, she whispered. These are plans for something incredible. Elias nodded, his finger tracing the same circular symbol that appeared throughout his father's notes. The mark from the aqueduct foundation was repeated dozens of times, always connected to sketches of water wheels, gear systems, and mechanisms that seemed impossibly advanced for any era. Your grandfather called it the ancient water mind. Elias explained, remembering his father's excited but often incomprehensible explanations. He believed the Romans had discovered principles of hydraulics that we'd lost. Said they could make water flow uphill, generate power from pressure differentials, even store energy in underground chambers. And everyone thought he was mad, Anya finished. Understanding flooding her voice, the university dismissed his theories. Said he was chasing fantasies. Elias's voice carried old pain. He died trying to prove them wrong, and I chose teaching because it seemed safer than following in his footsteps. Anya turned a page, revealing a detailed cross-section drawing of what appeared to be the aqueduct they'd purchased that afternoon. But her grandfather's version showed hidden chambers, complex valve systems, and mechanical components that definitely weren't visible in the ruins they'd examined. "Papa, look at this." She pointed to a series of measurements written in their grandfather's precise hand. These dimensions match the aqueduct exactly. He wasn't theorizing about Roman engineering. He was documenting a specific structure. Our structure. Elias studied the diagram with growing amazement. His father had drawn the aqueduct's foundation symbol in perfect detail, surrounded by notes about pressure chambers and hidden access points, and the key lies in understanding the flow. But how could he have known? Elias wondered aloud. The aqueduct was sealed when I was a boy. No one could get inside to measure it, unless someone could. Anya's eyes gleamed with the same intensity that had driven her grandfather's research. "Papa, what if grandfather found a way inside? What if he discovered something that proved his theories but died before he could share it?" The possibility hung between them like a challenge. Elias remembered his father's last words, whispered in the delirium of his final illness. "The water remembers, Elias. Find the aqueduct. Make them understand the water remembers everything." At the time, he dismissed it as fever dreams. Now, staring at these impossibly detailed plans, he wondered if his father had been more lucid than anyone realized. "There's something else," Anya said, pointing to a page near the back of the manuscript. "Look at these calculations." Grandfather was estimating water flow rates for the entire valley, not historical analysis, future projections. As if he expected the aqueduct to work again, Elias studied the numbers, his teacher's mind automatically checking the mathematics. The calculations were complex but sound, predicting water distribution patterns that could serve not just their town, but several neighboring communities. If his father was right, the aqueduct wasn't just a historical relic, it was a solution to the drought that had been slowly strangling the region for decades. "Anya," he said slowly, "what if this isn't about preserving the past at all? What if your grandfather left us instructions for saving the future?" She grinned, and in that moment she looked exactly like her grandfather had during his most inspired moments of discovery. "Then I think we need to go back to that aqueduct tomorrow. And this time we bring tools." Dawn came with the kind of crisp air that made every sound carry farther than it should. Elias returned to the aqueduct, carrying his father's old surveying instruments, and a determination that felt both heavier and lighter than the metal tools clattering in his pack. Anya had wanted to come, but he'd convinced her to wait. If his father's theories proved correct, they'd need her mechanical intuition for the more complex discoveries ahead. Standing before the structure in the early light, Elias could see details that hadn't been visible during the auction crowd's distracting presence. The aqueduct was in better condition than it appeared from a distance. The mortar between stones showed signs of recent maintenance. Metal fittings that should have been rusted through had been cleaned and oiled. Someone had definitely been caring for this supposedly abandoned ruin. He began his inspection at ground level, walking slowly around the foundation while consulting his father's diagrams. The manuscript showed 3 additional access points beyond the obvious main channel, each marked with the circular sun symbol. He found the first carved into a support beam on the eastern side, exactly where his father had indicated. The second was hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soil and debris. The third symbol was different, where his father's notes showed a simple carving. Elias discovered an actual mechanism, The circular mark formed the center of a stone disc that rotated when pressed. The three extending lines weren't just decorative elements. They were handles designed to turn the disc in sequence. Following his father's detailed instructions, Elias pressed and rotated each line in the pattern described in the manuscript. The stone moved smoothly, as if it had been maintained and used recently. With a grinding sound that seemed far too loud in the morning stillness, a section of the aqueduct's foundation swung inward, revealing a passage that led down into darkness. "Well, father," Elias murmured, lighting his lantern, "let's see what you discovered." The passage was narrow but well constructed, with carved handholds that made descent manageable for someone of his father's advanced age. The air smelled of mineral water and something else. Oil, perhaps, or the metallic scent of maintained machinery. After 20 feet, the passage opened into a chamber that took Elias's breath away. His father's manuscript had prepared him for hidden rooms. But the reality exceeded every expectation. The chamber stretched back into the aqueduct's foundation, its walls lined with intact Roman stonework that showed no signs of age or deterioration. But more remarkable than the construction were the mechanisms. Gear systems and water wheels filled the space, all crafted with precision that belonged to no historical period Elias could identify. The metalwork was too advanced for ancient Rome, too sophisticated for medieval engineering, yet too weathered to be recent construction. It was as if someone had discovered principles of hydraulic engineering centuries ahead of their time and hidden the evidence in this underground chamber. Moving deeper into the space, following his father's mapped route, Elias discovered the source of the fresh maintenance. Tools lay neatly arranged on a stone workbench. Not ancient implements, but relatively modern wrenches and measuring devices. A leather journal sat open beside them, filled with handwriting he recognized as his father's. The final entries were dated just days before his father's death 20 years earlier. "Success," read the last complete entry. "The system responds to pressure differentials exactly as the original designers intended. Water can be drawn from underground sources and distributed through the valley with minimal manual oversight." The ancient engineers weren't just building an aqueduct, they were creating a perpetual water management system that could operate independently for decades. Below that, in shakier handwriting, Horn suspects. "Must hide the evidence until Elias is ready. The boy has the mind for it, but not yet the courage. Someday he will need what I've found here." Elias sank onto a stone bench, overwhelmed by the implications. His father hadn't died chasing impossible theories. He died protecting the discovery that could transform their entire region's future. And somehow Darius Horn had known about it even then. A sound from the passage above made him freeze. Footsteps, careful but audible, descending toward the chamber. Someone else knew about this place. Someone who moved with the confidence of familiarity. Elias extinguished his lantern and pressed himself against the chamber wall, listening as the footsteps reached the bottom of the passage. A new light appeared, and with it a voice he didn't recognize. Still maintaining the equipment, just as he asked, the voice muttered. 20 years of keeping his secrets, and for what? So some schoolteacher could stumble into what he died protecting. The light moved through the chamber, illuminating details Elias hadn't noticed in his excitement. Fresh oil on the gears, recently replaced components. Signs of ongoing care and operation. The old man was right about one thing, the voice continued. This could change everything. Too bad he was also right about Horn wanting it buried. The footsteps began moving back toward the passage, but paused near where Elias hid in the shadows. "Marrow," the voice called softly. "I know you're down here. Your lantern was still warm when I arrived." Elias stepped into the light, finding himself face to face with a weathered man in work clothes, someone who moved with the bearing of a soldier but carried the tools of an engineer. "Captain Rourke," the man introduced himself. "I work for Councilman Horn, but I've been maintaining this place since your father died. He made me promise to keep the mechanisms functional until you were ready to claim them. My father knew you. Your father saved my unit during the border conflicts. We were trapped without water for days before he showed up with one of his impossible engineering solutions." Rourke's expression was unreadable. When he asked me to guard his discovery, I couldn't refuse, even if it meant lying to my current employer. Elias studied the man's face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only exhaustion and conflicted loyalty. "Horn suspects you're down here," Rourke continued. "He's been watching the Aqueduct since the auction. You don't have much time before he decides to take direct action." "What kind of direct action?" Rourke's smile was grim. "The kind that makes problems disappear permanently. Your father's discovery threatens everything Horn has built his wealth on. He won't let you expose it without a fight." The weight of legacy and responsibility settled across Elias's shoulders like his father's old surveying pack. In this hidden chamber, surrounded by impossible mechanisms and 20 years of carefully guarded secrets, he finally understood what he'd inherited, along with that 35-cent purchase. Not just an aqueduct, not even just the solution to his region's water crisis. He'd inherited a war, the sign hanging crooked above. Luciana Vera's door read, "Historical Research and Documentation Services." But the peeling paint and rusted hinges suggested business had been scarce for quite some time. Elias knocked twice before hearing footsteps inside, followed by the sound of multiple locks being undone. The woman who answered bore little resemblance to the polished academics he remembered from his university days. Luciana's dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid. Her clothes were dusty from fieldwork, and her eyes held the wary sharpness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. She looked him up and down with the calculating gaze of a person accustomed to disappointment. "If you're here about tomb robbing or treasure hunting, you can turn around right now," she said without preamble. "I don't help people destroy historical sites for profit." "I'm here about engineering," Elias replied. "Specifically, Roman hydraulic systems that might have been more advanced than traditional scholarship suggests." Something flickered in her expression, interest warring with suspicion. "And you are?" "Elias Marrow. I teach at the local school, but more importantly, I just inherited some research that I think might interest you." She studied his face for a long moment, then stepped back to let him enter. The interior of her small office was a testament to obsessive scholarship, every surface covered with maps, diagrams, photographs of ancient stonework, and stacks of academic journals. But Elias noticed that many of the journals bore rejection stamps, and several bore her name as author on papers marked "Publication Declined." "Luciana Vera," she said, gesturing for him to sit in the room's single-client chair. "Former professor of classical archaeology at the university, current resident expert on theories nobody wants to hear." Her smile was bitter. "What kind of engineering research are we talking about, Mr. Marrow?" Elias pulled his father's manuscript from his coat, watching her expression change as she recognized the quality of the technical drawings. "My father believed the Romans had developed hydraulic principles centuries ahead of accepted historical timeline. He spent years researching a specific aqueduct, and I think he found proof." Luciana's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, her trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of what she was seeing. "These aren't reconstructions or hypothetical designs," she whispered. "These are technical documentation of existing mechanisms." "Where did your father obtain these measurements?" "The aqueduct itself. The one I purchased yesterday at the territorial auction." She looked up sharply. "You bought the old Roman structure outside town? The one everyone says is just decorative ruins?" "For 35 cents. "And it's not decorative." Elias leaned forward, deciding to trust her with the full truth. "There are hidden chambers underneath, filled with working machinery. My father maintained them in secret for years before he died." Luciana set the manuscript down carefully, her academic skepticism warring with obvious excitement. "Mr. Marrow, if what you're suggesting is true, it would revolutionize our understanding of ancient engineering. But it would also make you some very powerful enemies. I already have those, apparently." Councilman Horn has been watching the aqueduct since I bought it, and I have reason to believe he's willing to use violence to keep my father's discovery secret. Darius Horn. Luciana's expression darkened. That explains a great deal. Do you know why I was dismissed from the university, Mr. Marrow? Elias shook his head. Though he could guess the answer, had something to do with challenging accepted theories. I published research suggesting that Roman engineering was far more sophisticated than mainstream archaeology admits. I presented evidence of mechanical systems, pressure-based hydraulics, even primitive automation in water management. The academic establishment dismissed my work as fantasy. She gestured to the rejection letters scattered across her desk. But Councilman Horn was very interested. He offered me substantial funding to continue my research privately, with the understanding that my discoveries would remain confidential. You turned him down. I turned him down because he made it clear he wanted to acquire advanced engineering knowledge for his own purposes, not share it with the world. A man who profits from water scarcity doesn't fund archaeological research out of scholarly curiosity. She picked up the manuscript again, studying a particularly complex diagram. But this is exactly what I've been looking for. Proof that ancient hydraulic engineering was capable of solving problems we consider modern. Elias felt something ease in his chest, the relief of finding someone who understood the magnitude of what his father had discovered. Then you'll help me. Help you do what exactly? Study the mechanisms? Document them? Or activate them? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question forced Elias to confront the decision he'd been avoiding since descending into the hidden chamber. His father's research wasn't just academic, it was practical. The aqueduct could be restored to function, bringing water to drought-stricken communities throughout the region. But doing so would directly threaten Horn's economic stranglehold on the area's water resources. All three, he said finally. I want to understand what my father discovered, preserve the knowledge, and make it work again. Luciana's smile was fierce and determined. Then we'd better move quickly. If Horn realizes what you found, he'll do everything in his power to destroy it before you can prove its value. She began gathering supplies, surveying equipment, measurement tools, and several cameras for documentation. When do we start? Tomorrow morning before dawn. And Dr. Vera? Elias paused at her door. There's something else you should know. My daughter has her grandfather's mechanical intuition. She's going to be part of this, whether I want her to be or not. Luciana's expression softened slightly. How old is she? 16. Old enough to understand the risks, young enough to believe we can overcome them. Good, Luciana said. We'll need that kind of optimism for what comes next. Brother Matteo appeared at Elias's door just after sunrise, moving with the quiet persistence of morning mist. The elderly monk wore simple brown robes and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to being underestimated. But his eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge carefully guarded and wisdom earned through decades of patient observation. Mr. Marrow, he said in accented English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of someone for whom Latin remained a living language. I believe we have matters to discuss. Elias had been preparing for his second descent into the aqueduct chamber, but something in the monk's manner suggested this conversation couldn't be postponed. Brother Matteo, isn't it? From St. Gabriel's monastery? Indeed, may I come in? What I have to share is not suited for doorstep conversation. Anya looked up from her breakfast as the monk entered, her mechanical curiosity immediately focusing on the leather satchel he carried. The bag was old but well maintained, and it bulged with the angular shapes of books or documents. You are Elena's granddaughter, Matteo observed, studying Anya with the same careful attention she was directing at his belongings. You have his hands, made for building rather than breaking. You knew my grandfather? Anya's voice carried surprise and hunger for information about the family legacy she'd only recently begun to understand. I knew him well. He came to our monastery many times in his final years, seeking access to our archives. We possess manuscripts that survived the fall of Rome, texts that mainstream scholarship believes lost forever. Matteo settled into a chair with the deliberate movements of advanced age. Your grandfather was particularly interested in engineering documents, technical specifications that the monks preserved because they understood their value, even when secular authorities dismissed such knowledge as worthless. Elias felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align. The aqueduct. He was researching the original construction methods. More than that, he was seeking to understand why certain Roman engineering projects were deliberately hidden, their true capabilities concealed even from historical record. Matteo opened his satchel and withdrew a manuscript bound in dark leather. This document was written by Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, the architect whose work forms the foundation of classical engineering knowledge. But this is not the version known to modern scholars. He opened the manuscript to reveal pages covered in detailed technical drawings and Latin text. But unlike the sanitized copies Elias had seen in university libraries, this version contained additional sections, marginal notes, and diagrams that suggested engineering principles far beyond what history claimed the Romans possessed. The complete works, Matteo explained, including the sections that early Christian authorities ordered removed from public circulation. They feared that such advanced technical knowledge might be used for purposes contrary to spiritual salvation. Anya leaned over the manuscript, her eyes widening as she recognized familiar symbols and mechanical principles. These are the same systems grandfather documented. The pressure chambers, the automated flow controls. It's all here in the original plans. Your grandfather spent months translating these texts, comparing them with his own discoveries in the aqueduct. He realized that the structure outside your town was not merely a water delivery system. It was a demonstration project, built to prove that advanced hydraulic engineering could transform entire regions. Elias studied the monk's face, searching for hidden motivations. Why are you sharing this with us now? Why not 20 years ago, when it might have saved my father from disgrace? Matteo's expression grew somber. Because 20 years ago your father asked me to wait. He feared that revealing such knowledge prematurely would lead to its misuse by men who prioritize profit over human welfare. He made me promise to share these documents only when someone with proper understanding and moral purpose sought to complete his work. And you believe that's us? Anya asked. I believe your grandfather was a man of remarkable foresight. He predicted that his son would eventually follow in his footsteps, driven by necessity rather than mere curiosity. He also predicted that powerful men would attempt to suppress or control his discoveries. Matteo's voice carried warning undertones. Councilman Horn visited our monastery several times after your grandfather's death, offering substantial donations in exchange for access to our archives. We declined his generosity. The implications were clear. Horn had been searching for the same knowledge that had driven Elias's father's research, but for entirely different purposes. There's something else, Matteo continued, withdrawing a second document from his satchel. A letter your grandfather left in our care to be delivered if and when you chose to pursue his work. The envelope bore Elias's name in his father's familiar handwriting. Inside, the letter was brief but profound. My son, if you are reading this, then the drought has finally forced you to look beyond the safety of conventional thinking. I pray that you have found allies worthy of the knowledge you now possess. The aqueduct is more than an engineering marvel. It is proof that human ingenuity, properly applied, can create abundance where others see only scarcity. But remember that those who profit from scarcity will not surrender their advantages without a fight. Trust carefully, act boldly, and never forget that the water remembers everything we teach it. Your father, Elias Marrow Elias, read the letter twice, feeling the weight of generational responsibility settling across his shoulders like his father's old work coat. "Brother Matteo, I need to ask you directly, whose side are you on in this conflict?" The monk was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded over the ancient manuscripts. "I am on the side of knowledge preserved for righteous purposes. But I must warn you, our monastery has maintained neutrality in secular conflicts for 8 centuries. I can share information, but I cannot offer protection if Councilman Horn decides to take direct action against you." "We understand," Elias said, "and we're grateful for what you've shared." As Matteo prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One final piece of advice, Mr. Marrow. Your father discovered that the aqueduct's mechanisms respond to specific sequences, combinations of pressure, timing and mechanical operation that must be executed precisely. The knowledge is in these manuscripts, but understanding it requires more than academic study. It requires the intuition that comes from working with water as a living force rather than a mere resource." After the monk departed, Elias and Anya sat in contemplative silence, surrounded by manuscripts that had suddenly transformed their amateur investigation into something approaching sacred duty. "Papa," Anya said finally, "I think we're going to need Dr. Vera's help more than we realized." The descent into the aqueduct chamber felt different with 3 people and proper equipment. Luciana moved with the careful precision of a trained archaeologist, photographing and measuring everything as they made their way down the hidden passage. Anya carried her grandfather's original tools, her hands already familiar with their weight and balance. Elias brought the combined manuscripts, his father's field, notes and Brother Matteo's ancient texts, creating a bridge between practical discovery and theoretical knowledge. But when they reached the main chamber, they found evidence that they were not the first visitors since Elias's initial exploration. "Someone's been here," Luciana observed, noting fresh scratches on the stone floor and subtle rearrangements of the mechanical components. Recently, Elias examined his father's workbench, confirming his fears. Several tools had been moved, and the leather journal now lay open to a different page than he'd left it. Captain Rourke mentioned that Horn suspects we're investigating the aqueduct. It seems his suspicions have become certainties. Anya was studying the mechanical systems with the focused intensity she'd inherited from her grandfather. "These aren't just water pumps," she announced. "They're designed to work in sequence, each mechanism preparing water pressure for the next stage. It's like a massive clockwork system, but powered by hydraulic force instead of springs and gears." Luciana began documenting the chamber's contents, her cameras capturing details that had remained hidden for centuries. But as she worked, her archaeological training revealed aspects of the construction that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. "Mr. Marrow, look at this stonework," she called from the chamber's far wall. The Roman sections are clearly ancient. You can see the weathering patterns, the settling marks. But these mechanical components are different. The metalwork is too precise, too well preserved. Elias joined her examination, bringing one of Brother Matteo's manuscripts for reference. The ancient text described the aqueduct's construction in detail, including specifications for mechanisms that matched what surrounded them. But the Latin also contained references that seemed impossible for the historical period. "Listen to this," he read aloud. "Vitruvius writes about hydraulic chambers that preserve and multiply the river's strength, storing power for times when natural flow proves insufficient." He's describing energy storage systems that we barely understand today. Anya looked up from a complex arrangement of gears and valves. "Maybe we understand them better than we think. Papa, what if the Romans didn't invent these principles? What if they discovered them?" The suggestion hung in the air as all 3 contemplated its implications. Luciana spoke first, her voice carrying academic excitement tempered by scholarly caution. "There are legends throughout the Mediterranean of engineers who possessed knowledge that seemed magical to their contemporaries. Archimedes, hero of Alexandria, others whose inventions were so advanced that later scholars dismissed the accounts as mythology rather than history. "But this is real," Anya said, running her hands along machinery that had obviously functioned for centuries. These mechanisms were built to work, not to impress visitors or demonstrate theories. Elias consulted his father's final journal entries, searching for guidance on operating the systems they'd discovered. The notes were detailed but cautionary, warning of the need for precise sequences and careful pressure management. According to father's research, the entire system operates as a network. The aqueduct we see on the surface is just the visible portion. The actual mechanism extends underground for miles, connecting to natural springs and underground rivers throughout the region. Luciana paused in her documentation, understanding dawning in her expression. If that's true, then this isn't just an aqueduct. It's a water management system for the entire valley. Restoring it wouldn't just bring water to your town, it could end the drought that's been strangling the whole region. The magnitude of the discovery was overwhelming, but it also explained Councilman Horn's determined interest in suppressing their research. His wealth and power depended on water scarcity driving up prices and forcing communities to depend on his controlled resources. Anya had found what appeared to be the system's central control mechanism, a complex arrangement of wheels, levers, and pressure gauges that her grandfather had marked with detailed operation notes. "I think I understand how this works," she said, her voice carrying the same excited certainty that had driven her grandfather's discoveries. "But we'd need to coordinate the activation sequence perfectly. One mistake could damage the entire network." "Then we don't make mistakes," Elias said, feeling his father's determination rising within him. "We study these manuscripts until we understand every detail, and then we bring this system back to life." But as he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed from the passage above, multiple people descending toward the chamber. The footsteps carried the heavy, purposeful rhythm of men who expected trouble. "Mr. Marrow." Captain Rourke's voice carried down the passage, but his tone was urgent rather than threatening. "You need to get out of there. Horn's coming with a full crew, and he's not planning to negotiate." Luciana was already gathering her equipment, but Anya remained focused on the control mechanism. "Papa, I can see how it works. Give me 5 more minutes, and I can activate at least part of the system." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by voices, Horn's cultured tones mixing with the rougher speech of hired men who solved problems with violence rather than words. Elias faced the decision that would define everything that followed. They could flee now, preserving their safety but leaving his father's life work vulnerable to destruction. Or they could make their stand in this chamber, surrounded by centuries of hidden knowledge and the machinery that could transform their world. "Anya," he said, "show me what needs to be done." The confrontation came like a summer storm, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. Darius Horn descended into the chamber, flanked by 4 men whose scarred hands and cold eyes spoke of violence as profession rather than passion. But it was Horn himself who commanded the space, his expensive coat and polished boots somehow more menacing than his hired muscles' obvious weapons. "Mr. Marrow," he said with the tone of a disappointed teacher, addressing a particularly slow student, "I had hoped we could resolve this matter through civilized discussion." Elias positioned himself between Horn and Anya, acutely aware that Luciana was still frantically photographing the ancient mechanisms, while his daughter remained focused on the control systems with dangerous intensity. "There's nothing to resolve, Councilman. This is my property, legally purchased." Horn's laugh echoed off the stone walls like breaking glass. "Your property." He withdrew a leather portfolio from his coat, extracting documents that bore official seals and territorial stamps. "I'm afraid there's been a clerical error, my dear fellow. It seems the aqueduct was never actually available for public sale. The papers looked authentic, more than authentic. They looked definitively legal in the way that only substantial bribes could achieve. Elias recognized the signatures of territorial officials, the stamps of surveyors' offices, even what appeared to be original Roman land grants, translated into modern legal language. These documents prove that the aqueduct has been under territorial preservation order for the past 50 years. Horn continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man playing chess against opponents who hadn't realized the game had already ended. Any attempt to alter, excavate or operate historical mechanisms within this structure constitutes a federal crime punishable by substantial fines and imprisonment. Luciana looked up from her work, her archaeologist's training immediately recognizing the implications. Those documents didn't exist yesterday. I've researched every territorial preservation order filed in the past century. This aqueduct was never listed. Dr. Vera, isn't it? Horn's smile carried the particular cruelty of a man who had researched his opponents thoroughly. The former university professor, whose wild theories about Roman engineering earned her such well-deserved professional disgrace. I hardly think your research qualifies as authoritative. The insult struck its intended target, but instead of retreating, Luciana stepped forward with the fierce determination of someone who had endured years of dismissal and condescension. My theories were dismissed by men who prioritized comfortable assumptions over inconvenient evidence. But what we've found in this chamber proves everything I've ever written about advanced Roman hydraulics. What you found, Horn said, gesturing to his men, is an opportunity to learn the consequences of trespassing on protected historical sites. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Elias felt his father's stubborn courage rising within him, tempered by very real fear for Anya's safety. But before he could respond, Captain Rourke stepped from the shadows behind Horn's group. "Councilman," Rourke said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this situation privately before making any decisions we might regret." Horn turned toward his employee with surprise that quickly shifted to suspicion. "Captain Rourke, I gave you explicit instructions to monitor Mr. Marrow's activities, not engage in unauthorized negotiations, and I've been following those instructions faithfully for 20 years, Rourke replied. His hand rested casually on his weapon, but his posture suggested protection rather than threat, which is why I'm qualified to advise you that destroying this chamber would be a mistake of considerable magnitude. The chamber fell silent, except for the distant sound of water moving through hidden channels, a reminder that the ancient systems were still connected to living springs and underground rivers throughout the region. Horn studied Rourke's face with the calculating gaze of a man reassessing a situation that had suddenly become more complex than anticipated. "Explain yourself." "Captain," Rourke gestured toward the mechanical systems that filled the chamber. Elias Marrow wasn't chasing fantasies when he researched this place. These mechanisms could solve the region's water problems permanently. Destroying them to maintain artificial scarcity might preserve your short-term profits, but it also guarantees that drought will eventually destroy the entire economic base you've built your wealth upon. Anya looked up from the control mechanism she'd been studying, her young voice cutting through the adult posturing with startling clarity. "He's right. This system could provide water for every community within 50 miles. Enough water for farming, manufacturing, population growth, everything you'd need for real prosperity instead of managed poverty." Horn's expression darkened at being lectured by a 16-year-old girl, but Elias could see calculation behind the anger. The councilman was a practical man above all else, and practical men understood the difference between short-term advantage and long-term survival. "Miss Marrow," Horn said with deceptive gentleness, "you're very young to be making pronouncements about economic policy. Perhaps you should leave such complex matters to adults with appropriate experience. Perhaps adults with appropriate experience should have solved our water problems decades ago instead of profiting from them." Anya shot back, her grandfather's fearless curiosity transforming into something approaching righteous indignation. The exchange revealed something crucial about Horn's position. He wasn't just protecting a business model. He was protecting a worldview that required scarcity to justify inequality. The aqueduct's restoration would prove that abundance was possible, that the drought had been allowed to continue because it served certain interests rather than because it was inevitable. Luciana had finished her documentation and now stood with photographic evidence that could revolutionize archaeological understanding of Roman engineering. "Councilman Horn," she said, "I have enough evidence here to publish papers that will draw international attention to this site. Academic delegations, government researchers, engineering teams from universities around the world. You can suppress a local schoolteacher's discovery, but you can't suppress peer-reviewed scientific research." Horn's men shifted restlessly, hands moving closer to weapons as they sensed their employer's mounting frustration. But Rourke's presence created a delicate balance. His loyalty remained unclear, making violence a risky option for all parties. "Dr. Vera," Horn said finally, "I think you overestimate the international community's interest in one man's mechanical fantasies. But if you're determined to publish, perhaps we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests." He reached into his coat and withdrew a bank draft that made Luciana's eyes widen despite her principled determination. The amount was substantial enough to fund years of independent research, restore her academic reputation, and provide financial security she hadn't known since her dismissal from the university. "Consider it a research grant," Horn continued, "in exchange for agreeing that your findings require further study before publication, and that premature disclosure might damage the historical integrity of the site." The offer was as insulting as it was tempting. Recognition and resources in exchange for silence and complicity. Luciana stared at the bank draft for a long moment before looking up at Anya, who was still working with the control mechanism despite the escalating tension around her. "And what about them?" Luciana asked. "What happens to the Marrow family if I take your money and walk away?" Horn's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "Mr. Marrow will face prosecution for violating territorial preservation laws, as will anyone who assisted him in damaging protected historical artifacts. Unless, of course, he demonstrates proper contrition by turning this site over to appropriate authorities." The meaning was clear: cooperate or face destruction. Elias felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing against his shoulders, demanding a choice between safety and principle. But before he could respond, Anya's voice cut through the negotiation with excited urgency. "Papa, I think I've figured out the activation sequence, but we need to move quickly. The pressure readings are fluctuating." Brother Matteo's appearance at the chamber entrance came like dawn breaking over a battlefield, unexpected, transformative, and carrying the potential to change everything that followed. But the elderly monk wasn't alone. Behind him walked two younger men in clerical robes, and their presence filled the underground space with an authority that even Horn's hired violence couldn't diminish. "Forgive the intrusion," Matteo said, his accented voice carrying across the chamber with surprising strength. "But I believe this discussion concerns knowledge that my order has guarded for 8 centuries. Horn turned toward the monks with visible irritation, his careful negotiations suddenly complicated by unexpected variables. "Brother Matteo, this is a private matter involving territorial law enforcement. I hardly think it requires ecclesiastical intervention." "On the contrary," Matteo replied, approaching the central mechanism where Anya continued her work. "This aqueduct was built under the auspices of the church, designed by engineers working in collaboration with monastic scholars. The knowledge preserved in its construction belongs as much to religious history as to secular archaeology." He gestured to his companions, who began unpacking equipment that looked distinctly non-clerical. Surveying instruments, measurement devices, and what appeared to be modern communication equipment. My colleagues represent the Vatican's Commission for Sacred Archaeology. They've come to evaluate this site for potential designation as a protected religious monument. The implications hit Horn like physical blows. Vatican involvement would bring international attention, scholarly scrutiny, and legal protections that even territorial authorities couldn't easily override. His careful plan to suppress the aqueduct's discovery was crumbling in the face of religious bureaucracy that operated according to entirely different rules. But Matteo wasn't finished. He approached Elias with an expression that mixed apology with determination, carrying a leather document case that seemed to weigh more than its physical contents should allow. "Mr. Marrow, I owe you an explanation that I hoped would never become necessary." He opened the case and withdrew papers that bore official seals, Vatican stamps, and signatures in multiple languages. "Your father didn't just research this aqueduct. He petitioned our Commission for Protection 20 years ago. His request was approved, but the designation was kept confidential at his request until such time as the discovery was ready for public revelation." Elias stared at the documents, recognizing his father's signature alongside official ecclesiastical approvals. "You mean this site has been under Vatican protection all along?" "Indeed. Which means that Councilman Horn's territorial preservation orders, however authentic they may appear, lack jurisdiction over church property." Matteo's smile was gentle, but implacable. "And any attempt to prevent legitimate archaeological research constitutes interference with Vatican authority." The revelation transformed the entire dynamic in the chamber. Horn's legal weapons were suddenly ineffective. His hired muscle faced the prospect of assaulting church representatives, and his economic stranglehold on regional water resources was threatened by an authority that operated beyond his sphere of influence. But the victory felt hollow to Elias as he processed the full implications of Matteo's revelation. "You knew this entire time. You knew I had legal protection, knew that my father had secured the site's future, and you let me believe I was taking desperate risks for a hopeless cause." Matteo's expression grew sorrowful. "Your father insisted that you must choose your path freely, without the safety net of institutional protection influencing your decisions. He wanted to ensure that your commitment came from moral conviction rather than guaranteed security." The betrayal cut deep, not because it was malicious, but because it revealed the extent to which his father had orchestrated events from beyond the grave. Every risk Elias had taken, every moment of doubt and determination, had been carefully stage-managed to produce the man his father believed the situation required. Anya looked up from the control mechanism, her young voice cutting through the complex adult emotions with practical urgency. "Papa, Brother Matteo, everyone, the pressure readings are critical. If we're going to activate this system, it has to be now." Luciana had finished reviewing Matteo's Vatican documents and now faced Horn with the confidence of someone whose position had fundamentally shifted. "Councilman, I believe our negotiation has reached its conclusion. This site is under international protection. My research has institutional backing, and your legal claims have been invalidated." But Horn wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. His expression had hardened into something approaching desperation, and desperate men with hired muscle made dangerous decisions. "Brother Matteo," he said with false reasonableness, "surely the Vatican's interest lies in preserving this site's historical integrity rather than allowing amateur enthusiasts to damage priceless artifacts with unauthorized experiments." The argument was clever, framing activation of the aqueduct as potential vandalism rather than restoration. But Matteo had spent decades studying the intersection of faith and knowledge, and he understood the difference between preservation and suppression. "The aqueduct was built to function," he replied simply. "Keeping it silent serves no purpose except to prevent the good it was designed to accomplish." Captain Rourke had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, But now he stepped forward with the decisive movement of a soldier who had finally chosen his side. "Councilman Horn," he said formally, "I hereby resign from your employment, effective immediately." He turned toward Elias and pulled a keyring from his coat pocket. "These are the maintenance access keys for the surface portions of the aqueduct system. Your father gave them to me for safekeeping, along with instructions that they should be returned to his family when the time came to fulfill his work." The gesture was both practical and symbolic. 20 years of secret loyalty finally revealed in the moment when it mattered most. Horn's support system was disintegrating as institutional protection, moral authority, and personal allegiance aligned against his attempts at suppression. But cornered animals were often the most dangerous, and Horn had built his wealth and power on the understanding that desperate situations required desperate solutions. "Very well," he said with the cold calm of a man who had accepted the necessity of extreme measures. "If legal means have proven insufficient, perhaps more direct action is required." His remaining men tensed, hands moving toward weapons, as they prepared for orders that would cross lines from which there could be no return. The chamber's ancient stones had witnessed centuries of human conflict, but the violence about to unfold would determine whether knowledge served greed or flourished in freedom. "Anya," Elias said quietly, "show me what needs to be done." The activation sequence required precise timing, coordinated pressure management, and absolute faith in mechanisms that had waited centuries for their moment of resurrection. Anya's hands moved across the ancient controls with the confident intuition of someone who understood machinery at a level deeper than intellectual analysis. While Elias consulted his father's detailed notes and brother Matteo's Vatican manuscripts to verify each critical adjustment, but Horn's desperation had crystallized into action that threatened to destroy everything before the aqueduct could prove its worth. "Stop them," he commanded his remaining men, his voice carrying the final authority of someone who had decided that losing everything was preferable to accepting defeat, whatever it takes. The hired muscle moved forward with professional efficiency, but Captain Rourke positioned himself between them and the control mechanism with the steady competence of a soldier who had found a cause worth defending. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," he said mildly, his hand resting on his weapon with casual readiness. "Captain," one of Horn's men said uncertainly, "you sure about this? There's still time to step aside, I'm sure." Rourke's smile was grim but determined. "Elias Marrow saved my unit during the border wars by solving an impossible water supply problem. I owe him a debt that 20 years of questionable employment hasn't come close to paying." The standoff stretched taut as wire, armed men facing each other across ancient stone, while the sound of moving water grew stronger in the hidden channels beneath their feet. But it was Luciana who broke the tension, not through violence, but through revelation that transformed the entire conflict. "Councilman Horn," she called from her position near the chamber's documentation station, "you need to see this photograph." She held up an image of the aqueduct's deepest mechanism, where her camera had captured details invisible to casual observation. Carved into the stone support structure, nearly hidden by centuries of mineral deposits, was an inscription in Latin that made Brother Matteo gasp with recognition. "What does it say?" Anya asked, her hands still, poised over controls that could activate the ancient system. Matteo approached the photograph with the reverence of a scholar, encountering a primary source that revolutionized established understanding. "Aqua omnibus vita," he translated. "Water brings life to all." But beneath that, in smaller text, built by order of Marcus Aurelius Corvus, for the benefit of generations yet unborn, the names struck the chamber's occupants with different levels of recognition. Elias knew it from his father's research, a Roman engineer whose works had been considered mythical until archaeological evidence began confirming impossible achievements. Luciana recognized it from academic papers that had been dismissed as fantasy. But Horn's reaction was the most telling. Corvus, he whispered, his face pale with something approaching fear. The inscription mentions Corvus. Brother Matteo studied Horn's expression with sudden understanding. You know that name. You've been researching it. The councilman's composure finally cracked, revealing desperation that went beyond simple greed. Corvus built water systems throughout the empire that operated for centuries without maintenance. Systems that could transform deserts into gardens, provide power for manufacturing, support populations far larger than local resources could sustain. His voice carried the frustration of someone who had sought such knowledge for years without success. If this aqueduct is truly one of his constructions, then activating it wouldn't just solve our regional water problems, Luciana finished, understanding flooding her voice. It would prove that advanced hydraulic engineering has been possible for nearly 2,000 years, and that scarcity has been a choice rather than an inevitability. The revelation reframed everything that had led to this moment. Horn's opposition wasn't just about protecting his business interests. It was about suppressing knowledge that would expose centuries of artificial limitation, revealing that abundance had always been achievable for those with sufficient understanding and will to implement it. Anya looked up from the controls with the bright excitement of someone who had just solved a fascinating puzzle. Papa, the final sequence is ready, but once I start it, there's no stopping the process. The entire network will activate, and water will flow throughout the region, whether we're prepared for it or not. Elias studied his daughter's face. Seeing his father's fearless curiosity and his wife's practical wisdom combined in a young woman who represented everything he hoped the future could become. Around them, the ancient chamber held its breath, waiting for a decision that would determine whether knowledge served suppression or liberation. Councilman Horn, he said finally, you have a choice. You can try to stop us through violence, knowing that Vatican protection and international attention will ensure your eventual defeat. Or you can help us manage the transition to a system that benefits everyone, instead of just the few who profit from scarcity. Horn's men waited for orders while their employer wrestled with options that ranged from desperate to catastrophic. But it was Captain Rourke who provided the decisive element, stepping forward with keys that would allow surface-level coordination of the aqueduct's reactivation. Mr. Marrow, he said formally, your father asked me to tell you something if this moment ever came. He said to remember that water always finds its way to where it's needed most, regardless of the obstacles people place in its path. Anya's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, following sequences her grandfather had documented in loving detail. Ancient mechanisms responded to her touch like instruments awakening from centuries of sleep, pressure gauges climbing toward levels that would push water through channels carved into living rock. The sound began as a whisper, distant movement in spaces too far away to see. But it grew stronger, more insistent, until the entire chamber vibrated with the force of water reclaiming its ancient pathways. Pressure built in systems designed by engineers who understood forces that modern science was still struggling to comprehend. And then, water burst forth from outlets that had been dry for generations, flowing with power that transformed the chamber from archaeological site to living demonstration of human ingenuity unleashed. The ancient mechanisms worked exactly as their creators had intended, proving that knowledge, once discovered, could transcend the centuries and serve new generations with undiminished effectiveness. But the true test would come above ground, where the aqueduct's restoration would either fulfill its promise of regional transformation or prove that some dreams were too large for reality to contain. It's working, Anya breathed, her voice filled with wonder at mechanisms responding to her commands like extensions of her own will. Grandfather, it's actually working. Through the chamber's stone walls came the distant sound of celebration, voices raised in amazement as water appeared in places where drought had reigned for decades, as ancient channels carried life back to communities that had forgotten what abundance felt like. The aqueduct had awakened, and with it, the possibility that knowledge and courage could indeed transform the world. The morning sun caught the water as it cascaded through the restored channels, each drop catching light like scattered diamonds. 3 months had passed since the aqueduct's resurrection, and the town that had once resigned itself to dust and desperation now hummed with an energy Elias had never witnessed before. He stood at the base of the ancient structure, watching Anya adjust a brass fitting she'd designed to regulate water pressure. Her grandfather's tools lay scattered around her feet, but her innovations went far beyond anything his father had imagined. Where the old engineer had seen function, Anya saw possibility. The flow rate increased by 12% overnight, she called down to him, wiping her hands on a cloth already stained with honest work. I think the sediment filters are finally operating at full capacity. Elias smiled, remembering how the townspeople had initially whispered about his foolish girl playing with machinery. Now they came to her with problems their grandfathers couldn't solve, treating her insights with the respect once reserved for master craftsmen. Your father would be proud, Luciana said, approaching from the town square where she'd been documenting the aqueduct's impact for the archaeological society that had suddenly reversed their opinion of her work. Letters arrived weekly now, requesting her expertise on similar discoveries across the continent. Both our fathers would be, Elias replied, though he no longer carried the weight of that legacy as a burden. The man who had died disgraced was now remembered as a visionary whose son had finally proven his theories correct. Captain Rourke emerged from behind one of the stone pillars, no longer wearing the dark coat of Darius's enforcer. The town council had voted him sheriff after his testimony helped convict the former councilman, and he took to the role with the same methodical dedication he'd once applied to darker purposes. Judge's decision came through this morning, Rourke announced, holding up an official document. Darius gets 10 years in the territorial prison. His property will be sold to fund repairs on the other water systems throughout the region. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Elias felt only a quiet sense of justice served. Darius had become irrelevant the moment water began flowing freely through every household in town. His power had always been an illusion, built on artificial scarcity. What about Brother Matteo? Luciana asked. Community service at the monastery, Rourke replied. Copying manuscripts for the town library. Seems appropriate that a man who hoarded knowledge should spend his time preserving it for everyone. Anya scrambled down from the aqueduct, her face bright with enthusiasm. I've been thinking about the Eastern Valley. If we extended the system using grandfather's principles, but with modern materials. She pulled out a sketch covered in precise measurements and innovative modifications. Elias examined her drawing, seeing not just technical skill, but genuine vision. His father had dreamed of taming rivers. His daughter dreamed of nurturing entire regions back to life. The town council meets Thursday, he said. Present your proposal then. As afternoon settled into evening, families gathered as they had each day since the restoration. Children playing in the fountain that had stood dry for generations, while their parents planned gardens they'd never dared imagine before. The aqueduct had returned more than water to their lives. It had restored their faith in tomorrow. Standing beside the flowing channels as darkness approached, Elias felt the steady pulse of water moving through stone, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of centuries. His father's disgrace had become the foundation for renewal, proving that even the most forgotten knowledge could reshape the world when courage finally gave it voice. The aqueduct flowed on, eternal and unstoppable, turning ruins into rivers of hope. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.